Hello and welcome to Challenge Accepted, the podcast that explores comprehensive engineering solutions for complex projects. In each season, we dive into a different project sector with a panel of experts discussing how they've tackled their industry's most complex challenges. This season, we're diving into PFAS, exploring the evolving regulations and how we're helping clients navigate this complex and rapidly changing landscape. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Hackenberg, and I am your host for this season of Challenge Accepted. I am a senior project manager in Langen's Philadelphia office and one of the leaders of our firm's PFAS practice. Today, we're going to be talking about unique challenges that PFAS can create in the context of land development and redevelopment work. And while redevelopment projects are particularly susceptible to the sting of PFAS, PFAS are not as intimidating as they once were. That's the point we want to get across in today's podcast, especially as we develop a body of experience and tools and practices to help steer projects through the PFAS minefield. Joining me today to talk about this subject are three seasoned Langen professionals, Scott Bisbort, Jeff Ramey, and Anna Stakowicz. Scott is an associate and an LSRP, that's a licensed site remediation professional in our Princeton, New Jersey office. Jeff Ramey is our Wisconsin operations lead based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Anna is a senior project manager based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Collectively, Scott, Jeff, and Anna have over 50 years of experience helping clients to navigate environmental issues connected to the land development and redevelopment process. So welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to have you joining us here today on Challenge Accepted. And I want to start by sort of laying the foundation for what we're talking about here today, which is land development and redevelopment work. Scott, I'm wondering if you can help us get started here to just give us some foundation on what are we talking about when we're talking about the land development and redevelopment process. What are examples of typical projects that we would get involved in and the kinds of environmental issues that crop up commonly aside from PFAS? We'll certainly get into the PFAS realm as the conversation goes on, but if you can just sort of lay the foundation for us, that would be great.
Yeah, Adam, great to be here today. Happy to talk about this important issue. You know, a lot of our clients are redevelopers. And so what we're talking about mainly today are what we consider to be quote unquote brownfield sites for the most part. You know, these are sites that often in urban areas, but also can be suburban. But you're looking at coming in, likely demolishing buildings that are there, or if it's a blighted property, that's already been demolished, but redeveloping that to something new. It could also be sites that were previously undeveloped, like agricultural use, for example, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, I know, in this podcast. The difference between this kind of site and like maybe other traditional legacy environmental remediation sites is that these are going to be really, timeline driven in large part. The investors and redevelopers are trying to get the site into, redeveloped and into use as quickly as possible, get the return on their investment. This does provide an opportunity for us as on the environmental remediation side to come in and expedite a cleanup a lot of times in comparison to a site that's an operating industrial facility. There's obviously restrictions to what you can do to remediate a site. In a redevelopment scenario, those restrictions are all, quote unquote, buildings and parking lots and such are often removed as part of the redevelopment process. You have the opportunity a lot of times excavate, which is mostly preferred if you can in a remediation scenario, cleanup scenario, to get it maybe even to an unrestricted use without a cap or engineering control. So you can quickly do that and meet, regulatory timeframes as well. Sometimes some of this is done with a little bit of a variance from what is the typical process under regulatory overview. And that's, I think, where Langen really shines. We have those relationships with regulators and, numerous states throughout the country where we know what they expect and can pick up a phone and talk to them. They know us as well and get through some of these hurdles pretty quickly and help that redevelopment and go through and meet the time frame, which also means, hopefully meeting budgetary costs as well.
Yeah, that's great, Scott. I heard you say quick and timely a few times. So key takeaway here, time is money on a redevelopment project. And that's an important differentiator between this and, like you said, the types of more traditional remediation projects that we sometimes work on. Anna, Jeff, anything to add there to what Scott said to sort of give us the foundation here?
With the time is money aspect, that makes a huge difference because with your typical environmental remediation projects, move at a methodical pace, you're meeting certain regulatory deadlines. You usually have a couple of months to put all of your stuff together and respond to the agency. When you're working on a land development project, the timeline is often accelerated. You need to minimize the amount of investigation and thought process up front because the developer is trying to make their finances work out. And also with redevelopment, you may or may not be in a regulatory program, but either way, usually when you're implementing the remedy, it's most effective to do that during construction. So if you are in a regulatory program, you may have to move ahead of where you are with the agency in order to make the decisions you need to make in order to build your building or whatever it is you're developing. And then also the decisions that are made are often driven by the client's risk tolerance. A lot of the projects that I work on for redevelopment are not in a regulatory program. So most of the time we're going through the environmental conditions with the client, discussing the different risks, and then whether or not they move into certain types of remediation is really up to how much risk they're willing to take on themselves.
Yeah. So with all of these factors at play, I'm imagining that on a fast paced, high stakes redevelopment project, surprises are probably pretty unwelcome. And, we're going to get into a little bit about the kinds of surprises that crop up on development and redevelopment projects, how PFAS plays into that scheme. But if you could just give us a little thumbnail sketch here to set the stage on what impacts can surprises have on these kinds of projects, just kind of big picture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the foremost and most obvious one is delays. We're talking about timing. So you find some impacted soils or impacted groundwater through dewatering, going for a dewatering permit, something in that nature, or you had a disposal facility lined up or a site to take exported soils to, if you have excess soils, and all of a sudden, if you find something in those soils during the redevelopment process and you have to find a different facility because the original one will no longer accept it, obviously that's a time factor and can be a cost factor as well, paying a premium to get rid of soils that you otherwise had not anticipated. And I think too, as you excavate soils, if you find impacts that you didn't know about, and then you got to replace those soils if there's an import cost too to that. So you get kind of hit on both sides of that. That's definitely one of the, two of the more common surprise factors, I would say, related to soils, import, export, and groundwater with dewatering issues.
I think that puts a lot of pressure on the environmental professionals working for the client to have a lot of foresight to know that these particular surprises and impacts, the farther they can see down to the cost of a remediation, they may be able to determine whether a project remains even viable from going on anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because costs and delays are going to be problematic. You could have reputational issues if you've got a project that drags on or changes significantly from what was initially anticipated. How do we look into the crystal ball or help our clients look into the crystal ball to anticipate some of these issues? I know that one of your areas of expertise is in environmental due diligence, and I think that's one of the most basic steps that we can take to help our clients to foreshadow what they might be coming up against on any given project. So can you talk a little bit about environmental due diligence, what that is, and how PFAS are now incorporated into that process?
What you're really getting at, Adam, is what we're the point of talking about here today is PFAS and how that impacts site redevelopment, the surprises from that. And I think, Jeff, we were asking Jeff about in the due diligence process, how do we look and consider that issue, especially, with PFAS?
PFAS has been a part of due diligence as a non-scope item for the better part of the last 10 years, with more and more compliant phase ones looking outside the scope at all PFAS compounds. For the last 2 years, since July 8th, 2024, two specific PFAS compounds, PFOS and PFOA, were listed as circle hazardous substances, which officially adopted them into the updated standard for a compliant, ASTM compliant phase one environmental site assessment. So now going forward from that point, you'll expect to see these two compounds evaluated along with the other CERCLA hazardous substances that are covered under these compliant phase ones.
So with that change, Jeff, is it sort of business as usual, or is there a new approach or a different approach that we need to take to certain aspects of the phase one due diligence process?
There's more to evaluate now because of PFAS. In the past, we would look at, it's obvious what sources of petroleum would exist from underground and above ground storage tanks. But with PFAS, it's manufactured and ubiquitous in a lot of chemicals. So we see it in industry, we see it used a lot in manufacturing, we see it in consumer and commercial practices and processes, and we see it a lot in present in aqueous film fighting foam or AFFF. So we have to evaluate these many more industries for the possible presence of PFOS, PFOA, and other PFAS compounds, which still remain part of the interest of business environmental risks.
I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that these compounds have been used in commerce for over 50 years now, actually almost 75 years. But for the vast majority of that time, they haven't been regulated. So the paper trail often isn't easy to follow. So when you're looking at a chemical list, for example, that a facility used to use, like how do you tease out whether PFAS might be part of any of the chemicals that are on that list? And are there tools to do that? Are there other tools that we're using as environmental professionals specifically designed to help us assess the potential PFAS risk?
Environmental professionals doing the phase ones have a myriad of tools at their exposure. There's an idea of given industries known and suspected use of PFAS historically based on SIC and NAICS codes that are well established. There's published literature that exists that aggregates industries and what PFAS compounds were used, and these are pretty comprehensive. There's also guidance documents from states and scoping statements that indicate what particular industries and sources of material possibly contain PFAS that provide clues as to when to dig deeper. And the environmental professional needs to be good at asking questions as part of the site reconnaissance and digging into the history and getting a look at MSDSs or material safety data sheets to be able to determine what chemicals were used at a site. And it's not obvious necessarily from these MSDSs that PFAS were used because the PFAS compounds, depending on when a particular MSDS was published, and especially the older published MSDSs provide less information, they have proprietary ingredients and proprietary components and may not indicate specifically in the section you'd expect to see that there is a PFAS present. However, there are other clues that are on those MSDSs that may indicate the use of PFAS in a particular product or mixture. And that's something that Langen has developed a special proprietary PFAS identifier tool that we use in due diligence. We also use this in compliance reporting, where we can determine the presence of possible PFAS compounds. And this is going beyond the two PFOS and PFOA into the realm of the 10,000 plus other compounds that exist in the family of PFAS using our search tool and the information that's on these data sheets and the information we get from our site reconnaissance.
That's really fascinating, awesome tool to have at our disposal. Jeff, you mentioned that there are guidance documents and different literature articles that aggregate information that would help the environmental professional to understand the kinds of sites that may be associated with the PFAS concern. And also, I think a point of emphasis that you made was like just the experience of the environmental professional and being able to tease out these things. So, and on a sort of round robin here, I think all of you have done environmental due diligence involving PFAS. What are some of the kinds of sites that we're aware of where there may be a PFAS risk?
I think just to tag on too about some of the tools, but also the challenges with PFAS due diligence is that, like Jeff said, we're going based off of a lot of clues. Because these compounds haven't been regulated for a long time, there's not usually a long paper trail. So interviewing the facility operators and the site owner is extremely important to see what they know about what might have been used in the past, but also keeping in mind that not everyone can remember everything that's happened in the past 50 years. For example, like if we're going to a facility that has an AFFF fire suppression system and the facility is telling us it's never been discharged, you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt because a lot of times there's no one there that could possibly remember every minute of the operation. And same with like an agricultural field. We come across agricultural fields that might have PFAS due to the application of biosolids or the use of certain pesticides. But again, if the field has been farmed for the last 150 years, the farmer that we're interviewing isn't necessarily going to remember or know every pesticide that's ever been applied or if biosolids have definitely been used or not. So that's a challenge we come across a lot.
Others' thoughts on kinds of specific facilities or challenges that come up with PFAS. And I guess we're going to get into challenges related to redevelopment, but just to give the listeners an idea of the types of sites and the breadth of sites that we're talking about here.
I think one of the more recent ones that has come up, areas of concern or that potentially could be something requiring further evaluation or, septic systems and reference, biosolids being applied. But those biosolids are coming from treatment facilities or even on residential properties. It has been found that PFAS has made its way into septic systems through consumer product use. We know how ubiquitous it is and how wide-ranging it is that where it's found. So I guess it's not surprising in some ways, but I think it's one thing that probably hasn't been thought of a whole lot until recently. And I think it's about through looking at residences that they found PFAS in, potable wells on site. So they attributed it back to septics, unfortunately. But I think that one has definitely come up on people's radars a lot more lately and when it hasn't previously.
Scott, I think I heard you say air there. Can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by air as a source of PFAS?
Oh, I don't know if I said air, but I'll say it now.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I misheard.
Yeah, no, you're right. Air deposition is one that's one of the pathways to PFAS being found in soils is what we're recognizing now. So, downwind of large manufacturing facilities known to have used PFAS, we're finding it. There's no other source, no other explanation for it being present. And it's been well documented that there's a regional area of impacts and it's been attributed to air deposition over decades of manufacturing. So that is another source to take into consideration when evaluating a property, especially if there's been testing and you've had results of PFAS detections at a site.
Yeah, unexplained, right? Otherwise unexplained. So, and, there's a global component to air emissions and deposition of PFAS, and there's a more like localized component where there's a facility that might have had an air emission of PFAS historically that resulted in deposition sort of in a localized urban area. And that certainly can and has come into play on project sites that we're working on. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we keep going here. So I guess I want to turn it back squarely on development and redevelopment projects now and really talk about what are some of the key aspects of these projects where PFAS challenges can arise. Like, what are the things that are going to bite you if you're a developer, redeveloper that you might not be expecting? And Anna, if you could get us going with this one, that would be great.
I think there's a couple of areas where PFAS can really impact development. The biggest one that I have encountered is the plans for import and export of soil and the management of soil on site. If you have PFAS in soil that's going off site, there's increased disposal costs, more coordination time to get that soil disposed, and then also finding import sources can be challenging. Also, if you are in a regulatory program or not in a regulatory program, you need to understand the framework within the state where you're working. So if the presence of PFAS on the site is going to push you into a regulatory program, you really need to understand that and what's involved with it. And maybe the state doesn't have PFAS regulations or they're kind of still figuring it out. You still need to understand what their latest position is so you know if maybe PFAS could trigger a reopener. There might be special considerations that you need to follow. And then also kind of tied together the water supply plan and plans for dewatering. If dewatering is required, if PFAS is in groundwater, that's going to impact your planning for both of those items.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, that's theoretically, those are the kinds of things that can and do happen on redevelopment projects. But like, let's make it real here. I know you guys have a body of experience on redevelopment projects. So I'm wondering, without naming specific sites or clients, if we can sort of have you share some anecdotes about how some of these issues have come into play in your redevelopment practice at Langen. Scott, you have a good one, I think, that we've talked a bunch about that I think might be a good one to start with.
Anna mentioned dewatering. I mean, that case in point had a site where there's no known PFAS impacts or source. They need to do dewatering on the site as part of the construction. For the dewatering permit, they had to do analysis of PFAS. And when that happened, they lo and behold discovered some pretty fairly, I'll say, significant concentrations in the groundwater, which, of course, in the state this was in, required reporting to the state and then followed with investigation. And some low level concentrations of PFAS were found in the soils, ended up not being above regulatory standards. But to the point I alluded to earlier, they had designated a facility for excess soils to be taken to for disposal. That facility would no longer take those soils with this new development of the detections of PFAS. So we had to scramble very quickly to find a different facility, and they were under a time constraint tied to some financing to the project. So in a matter of less than a month, we had to pivot, find a different facility for them, and export of. It was an issue with the capacity as well, because there was tens of thousands of yards of material that had to come off. And so it was the challenge of the additional contamination being found with the PFAS, and also, the volume of soil that needed to come off.
So there was a plan in place for this project, and the plan was turned on its head by somebody's decision to take a sample of groundwater for PFAS. Is that basically the gist of it?
Well, they had to take it because it was a requirement of the dewatering permit was to discharge the municipality to the utility authority, local utility authority, and they required reporting. There's no regulatory standard that they were adhering to in this state, but they did require it to be reported. When I say no regulatory standard for the facility to accept a certain level of PFAS,
Right.
but there is a regulatory standard in groundwater, and that's where it was detected. So that one thing led to another, and that's how it happened. So no one had anticipated there would be this concern, but I don't know, the planning for dewatering wasn't taken into consideration, I guess, in the early stages of the redevelopment process.
Right. So surprise, right? It's one of those
Yep.
situations where I'm not sure if we did the due diligence or somebody else did, but in any case, it sounds like there wasn't really good reason to expect that there would be PFAS here,
Correct.
save maybe for the fact that I think you're explaining to me that this particular site is in an urban area, right? And if the whole process had been thought through maybe ahead of time, you could have maybe anticipated that there could have been some
Yeah.
issues with PFAS, but nothing was there that would have risen to the level of identifying like a recognized environmental condition as a result of the phase one environmental site
Exactly.
assessment process, right? So that's kind of like
Yeah.
this perfect example of how you might have something doesn't qualify as a wreck, but it still might be really worth having a conversation about the potential risks and client risk tolerances. And is this something that we want to think ahead about and plan for?
Case in point is that we think as investigations have developed that this is a regional issue, in an urban area. And it may be due to air deposition or other, yet to be identified sources offsite. So, in all fairness, it's one of those issues that didn't warrant, like you said, rising to level of sampling groundwater on the site. There was no source or potential source of PFAS on this site. So it didn't rise to that level of a wreck. But unfortunately, it did come
So
up.
somebody required the sampling for other reasons and off to the races.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Yep. And I know you've got a ton of experience in this realm of redevelopment, like large scale redevelopment projects where PFAS has been a consideration and clients have had an evolving sort of perspective and approach to that over time. So I'm wondering if you can share some tales from your experience.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a couple of projects in states that don't currently have a regulatory framework for PFAS, but the client is very environmentally savvy, so they wanted to understand and manage their risk. Both sites were former agricultural properties. There was no industry ever present. They're rural sites. There was a history of the use of pesticides and I think biosolids on the other one. And we ended up doing comprehensive surface soil sampling, which identified PFAS above the US EPA regional screening levels. Because again, these states don't have their own regulatory framework. We're going by US EPA. Based on that data, the client wanted to scrape off all of this surface soil, either stockpile or burn it on site or dispose of it, and then replace the material with clean fill. Now, when we went out to go identify PFAS-free fill, we sampled multiple sites. None of the sites were places that we would have suspected PFAS to be present based on the environmental history, but it turned up on every single one. And just to remind everybody listening, when we're going out to sample for PFAS, we're looking at concentrations in the parts per trillion. Typically, with a lot of other environmental contaminants, we're looking at parts per million or parts per billion. It does not take a lot of PFAS to be present before you're above the screening criteria. So with this challenge, because they couldn't identify clean fill, they had to pivot, and we ended up actually doing a risk assessment. One of Langen's toxicologists looked at the concentrations present on site, the types of possible exposures to future occupants, which in this case was workers, and then used all of that to calculate the potential cancer risk or health hazard, and was able to determine, based on the site use and exposure pathways, that there wasn't a concern for the workers. And again, all of this was done outside of a regulatory program. We were using the risk assessment really to give the client comfort that the site was going to be safe for their workers and that they weren't going to be taking on a lot of risk as a result of the PFAS.
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of bring up the point that some states don't have well-developed regulatory programs for PFAS and sometimes not for other contaminants either. So you end up helping clients to navigate an approach that meets their level of risk tolerance and also is based on sound science that we have from EPA. But it brings me back to another issue that I think Scott introduced when he was telling his story about there are some cases where a state may have like a cleanup level in soil that would be applicable to a redevelopment project. But on the other side of things, we know that the soil has to be remediated because it exceeds the cleanup level. But then on the disposal end, we're not really sure what to do with the soil because there aren't any rules or regulations on that side of the equation. So, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that and how we're helping our clients to navigate the soil disposal side of the equation.
I could start and kind of share experience I had. Some facilities, I guess, maybe requiring analysis of it, but I did have a situation where actual profile, the generator certification on it for a facility we're looking to take soil to had a sentence that said, I certify this material has never been contaminated with PFAS. It didn't even say to the best of my knowledge. And a phase 1 had been done on this property, so that wasn't really an issue. PFAS was part of the evaluation. There wasn't found to be any known source or potential source. So we didn't have a reason to suspect it, but it's just was an overly broad statement that we felt and the client felt maybe exposed them to some potential liability if someone at that facility or otherwise were to collect a sample and there could be some residual background type concentrations. This was in an urban area the soil was being generated from. Even if they weren't above regulatory level, contamination wasn't defined in this sentence, in the statement, in the certification. So again, just way too overly broad. Lawyers would have a field day with that kind of statement, and they did. So in protecting our client, said you shouldn't be signing this. And we worked with them to tweak that sentence to make it more specific to saying about an evaluation being done and no known source or discharge of PFAS on the site, which ended up being enough to satisfy everyone and get the soils approved at this facility. So it was a win-win in the end, but that's the first I've seen that come up on a profile and the certification that the generator is being asked to sign off on.
Yeah, and it's just interesting because none of this was based on a regulatory requirement. Everything
Correct.
that you are talking about here is swirling around the generator's risk tolerance and the receiving facility's risk tolerance and coming to some agreement as to how we're going to navigate and deal with that because there's a vacuum of rules that govern this stuff. And the playing field is constantly evolving here. So, yeah, I think one of the conversations that this group has had, we were talking about you may have a facility that you've identified that says they'll take the soil. And then 6 months later, when the project is actually getting off the ground, it may be a different story. There may be a different level of risk tolerance. So it's something that we have to be constantly vigilant of.
But on the flip side, Adam, it is a constantly evolving market for disposals. It's up to the facilities accepting the waste, whether or not they will take impacted solids with PFAS in it. Their definition of these facilities and their risk tolerance has changed over time. And in particular, a project that I've worked on, we had very few options very early on in the investigation and remediation of this transaction. And we ended up going to a subtitle C landfill, so disposing hazardous waste on some really minimally impacted soil. And then 2 years later, at this site, we ended up having some more soil generated that we wanted to dispose of and looked at our disposal options again and was able to determine and find a facility that was a subtitle D landfill who was willing to provide indemnification. Both situations provided an indemnification for our client and the waste that was generated from the subtitle C and subtitle D landfill. So as more is known about waste and more materials that may be known to contain PFAS go into the landfills now, since there is more knowledge, there is a changing landscape, and it's always worth asking those extra questions to be able to save the client potentially a large amount of money.
Yeah, so that's kind of the opposite scenario that I was talking about. I was thinking, well, it could get worse, but you're talking about, well, actually, it got better. More options opened up to you as time went on, so that can happen as well.
It's important, like what Jeff's saying, it's somewhat the client risk, how much they're risk averse maybe. I had a client where we could take it to a subtitle D facility for some low levels or subtitle C for some higher levels, but they have had some, experiences where they have some liability associated with some materials, not PFAS related, but from other cleanups at landfills where there's been issues. So they've chosen just to have it incinerated, which is, the least amount of risk and liability for them going forward. Of course, that comes with a premium, but they're willing to pay it in this situation. It's not an overly significant amount of soil, let's say, that they're getting rid of. They're getting rid of some drums. So when you're into larger volume of material that you need to get rid of, I know this becomes a little more cost prohibitive. But in this situation, since it's only a few drums material, they're willing to go that route.
Yeah, so we've touched on a bunch of things here. We paid a lot of attention to soil import, export issues with PFAS. Anna, you talked a little bit about the surprise that biosolids application can introduce to a project site. We touched a little bit on dewatering. I don't know if anybody has more to share on that. That definitely consideration. I had a project in Miami where there was a plan to dewater a foundation that was being dug for a high-rise tower, and it contemplated PFAS, but nevertheless, PFAS were present in the dewatering water at concentrations that were higher than expected, and that caused a pivot in the disposal options for that and delayed the project, increased costs. But another issue is the water supply for a redevelopment project. Do you have any specific examples, perspective, or anecdotes that would touch on that topic?
On a couple sites I worked on where there's not public water supply and there's some known groundwater contamination from PFAS, they've had to do some testing to drill deeper wells to get into a quote unquote clean aquifer beneath the site, which they did fine. But the developer knew that going into it. That was part of our due diligence process, identifying these regional impacts and shallow groundwater contamination. And they knew there was not public water available to the site, and they knew they could not use the shallow water, so they had to come up with an alternative solution. So we did some aquifer testing for them and were able to develop a plan to use water for supply at the site from deeper wells.
Yeah, and some of these development projects are water intensive, especially if it's like an industrial facility or a data center, for say, that's a water intensive type of use. And things to think about are how does PFAS impact the viability of the water supply plan? Because even if you're in an area where there's no known source, it can be present and you may end up having to deal with it, even if your site, your project site, isn't the source. I mean, that can happen in the context of both water supply plans for projects and dewatering plans for projects as well. So, all really important things to bear in mind. This last few minutes was a lot of, a little bit of sky is falling type of things. What can go wrong on a redevelopment project? I want to pivot now the conversation to how do we help our clients to anticipate and avoid these kinds of scenarios. Jeff, I want to maybe give you first crack at this one.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think it's real important to really understand the client's goals and risk tolerances on the front end. And that starts with due diligence and determining what side of the redevelopment they're on and what their end goals for the property and end use will be. And I'll point one thing out in particular that was a real recent project that I was on. It was a due diligence for a facility that had mostly undergone demolition. There was tanks of a certain size, greater than 50,000 gallons, which indicated that there was likely an AFFF system on site at one point, but there was no documentation.
That would indicate the potential use of AFFF fires.
Yeah. So petroleum tanks, these are petroleum tanks of over 50,000 gallons, which would have a requirement to have a fire suppression system and an AFFF system. There is no documentation on the presence, disposal. There's no information on this particular system. So in due diligence, that became a data gap and actually became a wreck on our investigation. So I think it's important to be able to find these things for our clients when it can protect them from a particular costly investment.
So, what I was thinking about, Adam, as you were asking that question, beyond like the due diligence aspect, which of course is extremely important, do your homework on it. But when we're talking about these surprises that can come up, planning for that, accounting for that, we've worked with developers and contractors in their bid specs that they've provided where they will have allowances in there for different disposal options from clean material all the way to hazardous. And that includes soils or materials that could be impacted with PFAS. So at least you could kind of put a context to that and maybe give a range of costs in that bid spec that as a developer you're putting out to contractors so you can plan, have a contingency, maybe even an adult below the line, so to speak, kind of cost that you could plan for. And I'd say my words of warning would be just make sure the contractors are paying attention to that and the language in their bids that they submit, whether or not it includes it. Because I've seen contractors still ignore it and it catches everyone a little off guard, maybe at times if they haven't looked that closely at it. So that's certainly one way we've helped clients navigate this.
Everybody wants to be the low bidder, right? And oftentimes that means sort of making overly optimistic assumptions. So I totally appreciate what you're saying, Scott. It's like we've got to work with our clients to make sure that the bidders are making appropriate assumptions and that they're accounting for some what if scenarios that could crop up. So it's really, really important.
And I would say similarly, that's related to soils and other, quote unquote, I'll say solid materials. But with the dewatering scenario, we talked about considering different options for disposal or discharge of groundwater that would be dewatered during construction. Is there an option to go to a different facility, or considering that you may have to treat it before discharging it, and what's cost involved with that, and just having an understanding of the order of magnitude for that in doing a budgetary cost estimate when considering a redevelopment project. So
maybe having some contingencies in place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that if it does happen, you're not caught off guard.
Right.
You've got a go-to thing instead of like having a major problem and delay right in the middle of construction. That's the worst possible time to start thinking about how to deal with surprise.
And that's when reevaluating your DD and really taking what you learned during due diligence and putting it through the lens of what the project plan is to figure out, okay, what media that are potentially impacted are we disturbing? How are we going to deal with that? Do we need to put controls in place so that future occupants are safe? Like thinking through all of those development considerations up front is super important because that's going to inform the bid spec, like Scott was saying. And another thing is just thinking through the entire project and evaluating what are all the regulatory touch points. So there may be some more obvious ones that are environmentally driven, like the presence of PFAS pushes you into this certain program, but there's other ones where people don't necessarily automatically think of environmental remediation as related, like your construction stormwater permit in Pennsylvania. You have to check a box saying whether or not there's contaminants present on site. And then if there are, that pushes you into a certain path. And then also like tack on to kind of the dewatering situation. That's usually if you're going to discharge to the municipal sewer, you're dealing with a small local regulatory agency who may not even have contemplated PFAS at all yet. We had a project in Ohio where we needed to discharge PFAS containing water to the municipal sewer. And when we first contacted them about our dewatering permit, they weren't even sure how they were going to handle this water, if they could take it, what permit requirements may apply. So contacting or figuring all of this out up front is super important so you can understand how much lead time there is, what's it going to take to get through these processes, all of that stuff.
Here's the optimistic view on regulations in some of these entities, now municipal or industrial commercial, becoming regulated for discharging PFAS as wastewater. Is there are more options for disposal, like we saw previously with the landfills. These entities that now have a permit goal for PFOS or PFOA, they may be able to take materials that are more highly contaminated and through their treatment processes and other mixing effects be able to take care of that waste, whether it's a municipal wastewater treatment plant or an actual commercial wastewater facility that is private to take those wastes. There are more options for disposal if you end up in a situation where you've got some dewatering material or other unplanned material at a redevelopment site that needs to be disposed of in short order.
I'm thinking about these scenarios where PFAS sampling might not have been done as part of the due diligence process for good reasons. Like the site that Scott was talking about, there was no reason at his project site to do PFAS sampling. But in that context, it came up in another way, right? A regulatory entity asked for PFAS sampling related to a dewatering permit. So is thinking beyond the small box of due diligence, what other ways like regulatory agencies or disposal facilities or somebody else might ask a question about PFAS, even if it didn't get flagged in the phase one? Is that an important step in the process of helping clients to think ahead?
Definitely, because I think not thinking through those items is how you end up with these surprise situations.
Yeah.
There may not be some obvious problem that you need to deal with and remediate during construction, but in Scott's example, I mean, something popped up and that derailed not only their dewatering plans, but also their soil export. So it's extremely important to be considering all of that up front.
But it can be dealt with, right? These problems are not insurmountable. They're not even all that scary anymore as long as you kind of face it head on. You come up with your scenario planning, what could happen, and develop some contingencies to deal with things that might come up in the world of PFAS. So I guess with that, I'd like to just sort of get perspective from the group here about the redevelopment market today. Where are we with PFAS? Is PFAS a major consideration, or does it have a chilling effect on the redevelopment market? Are deals being abandoned? Are they still going through, but with additional safeguards? Like, what are we seeing out there in the marketplace right now, just to give listeners some perspective on where things stand?
Yeah, I think everyone's adapting, I'll say, right? Like the deals are happening. PFAS, I mean, it's still obviously a concern that needs to be taken into consideration, but I think it's falling more into the category of a lot of the other concerns that you have on a site, the chemicals that are more well known. We're getting to know more and more about PFAS. The remediation technology is developing. I mean, we're still in the process of doing that. We know it still is a little bit harder to treat than some other petroleum compounds, for example, that are more common out there. But I think we've found ways and we're finding more and more ways of how to handle that and treat it. And I think regulatory agencies, to what you were alluding to before, Jeff, just a moment ago, with more standards coming into place, more regulations coming into place, regulatory agencies are adapting to that as well and providing more and more guidance as to how to move forward and handle it. So the redevelopers hate nothing more than uncertainty, right? Everyone wants certainty. So I think that's where we're going towards with PFAS. That we're gaining more certainty of how to handle these situations. So even though there may be a cost premium in certain situations, that can be quantified a little bit better and we can understand what that process is and give a developer certainty in that process, which goes a long ways into making a deal happen ultimately and getting these properties, through this process and making them profitable to the developers to tackle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think like 5 to 7 years ago, if we came across a site that had any kind of PFAS concern, it scared a lot of people away. But now that, like Scott was saying, the regulatory environment's becoming a little bit more known, there's a lot of scientific research and treatment options available. People are starting to realize that the same tools that we use to deal with any other type of environmental contamination can be adapted for PFAS scenarios. And so people are able to become a lot more comfortable with the situation.
Are clients, like being more picky about their site selection process, or is it sort of business as usual in that regard too?
I would say they're being a little bit pickier in that I'm seeing people walk away from sites with really significant PFAS concerns, something like a fire training center burn pit or a facility that might have had a huge AFFF release. Even biosolids facilities I've seen clients walk away from, but the ones that are maybe there's a surrounding source or it's a well-defined, smaller kind of concern, that doesn't they don't shy away from that anymore.
Yeah, and one of the things I've seen is it's for the smaller redevelopments and smaller transactions, PFAS can really be more problematic than for the larger ones. The 8 and 9 figure and bigger transactions are able to have enough certainty in the regulations and understand, the long-term costs and be able to fit that into the transaction and into the redevelopment. I see that and those types of transactions occurring at a higher rate now than they had happened before when a PFAS issue is identified.
Great. I mean, I think the message that we're hearing here is that PFAS maybe aren't as scary as they once were in the redevelopment process. Regulators, developers, and consultants like this are getting more comfortable with how to deal with PFAS. We have a lot more tools in our tool chest. We have processes to help our clients navigate through these risks and make intelligent decisions and to help them sort of understand the range of scenarios that they might encounter on any given site and plan ahead for that. So I think it's really encouraging. You guys are all doing great work, and thank you so much for joining us today on Challenge Accepted. And so with that, we'll say goodbye and see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
All right.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Challenge Accepted, PFAS. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and write a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, check us out on LinkedIn and Instagram at Langen, ENGENV, or visit langen.com/PFAS. See you next time.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.